Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Salazar. I am a technical marketing manager for Ativo Networks. And today we are going to talk about disrupting the attacker's toolkit. This is the Identity Security Bootcamp series, part 1. My name is Joseph Salazar. I'm technical marketing for Ativo Networks. As a reminder, this webinar is using the Threat Defend platform and its various components to illustrate concepts through quick demonstrations and walkthroughs. Now, if you do have any questions about the products and topics covered here, please visit www.ativonetworks.com. So these are the topics we'll be covering in the bootcamp. Part 1 is going to focus on things an organization can do before an attack. This part covers visibility, attack surface reduction, and concealment. Now, section 1 covers seeing what attackers can attack, which discusses reducing the identity and network attack surfaces. And section 2 covers preparing defenses, which will discuss deploying defenses for endpoints, Active Directory, on-premises networks, and the cloud using bait, concealment, and attack redirection. Now, part 2, which will happen next, will focus on things an organization can do during an attack. So let's talk about the things that you can do before an attack. First up, seeing what attackers can attack. As I mentioned before, this is all about identifying vulnerabilities to understand and reduce the attack surface. Now, there are 3 areas of focus when understanding the addressable attack surface. And when I say addressable attack surface, this is what the attacker can actually target. At the endpoint, the goal is to identify and remediate credential exposures and misconfigurations that create attack paths between systems. Attackers will use these attack paths to move laterally. Now, with Active Directory, the goal is to identify and remediate exposures and misconfigurations that attackers can exploit to conduct reconnaissance, identify targets, steal credentials, and escalate privileges for lateral movement. With the cloud, the goal is to identify and remediate cloud identity risks and entitlement exposures so attackers can't take advantage of excess privileges to compromise the entire network. So rather than going through a whole bunch of slides, what I'm going to do is demonstrate and talk about these concepts on our actual products. So first, let's start with ThreatPath. Now, ThreatPath is our solution that looks for lateral attack paths between systems. This is our ThreatPath solution. The ThreatPath solution is designed to look for credential exposures and misconfigurations at the endpoints that will allow attackers to move laterally between systems. Across the top, you see some quick statistics on the data that the ThreatPath has gathered. Now, because this is a demo environment, there are only a limited number of systems. You'll see the attack paths and remediated credentials and vulnerabilities down here directly below on the left-hand side. And it tells you when they were found as well. And on the right-hand side, you have a summary. Now, each of these items is a clickable filter. For example, we can go to Active Directory ACL scene, and this identifies all of the access control list user permissions that are detected. So for example, the MySQL CRM server user has all of these permissions, has all of these access control list entries so that they can write to these ACLs, or they have permissions to these ACLs. And the goal here is to identify these paths and remove them before the attacker can take advantage of them, like same password paths, etc. Now, from a information perspective, this is all useful, but we really want to see are the actual attack paths. So here are some of the attack paths that we've noticed. And again, we list them by table, we list them by the credential, the type of detection, how many targets, whether they're multiple or single, et cetera, et cetera. Where the power comes is when we look at them from a visual standpoint. So here is a visual path, a visual view of all of those attack paths by credentials, by systems, and by groups. So for example, this user, Scott Gill, he belongs to the domain administrator group. This arrow, which is colored red, shows that this is a critical vulnerability because this allows domain admin pilferage. Now, this user, unfortunately, has this login saved on an endpoint. And because that is saved on an endpoint, and as you can see, you can hover over each of these arrows to identify the exposure. Because it's saved on that endpoint, that means that an attacker can steal that credential and gain admin access across the entire environment. What's worse, if you look at the other arrow, this has an active RDP connection session. I'm sorry, this is as a saved RDP session as well. So this RDP credential is in memory, which means it's been saved to this local system. And so whoever can access, for example, green apples, which shows all of these credentials and credentials that are available, which includes Scott Gill, will gain access to RDP and domain admin rights. Now, if I look at green apple, I also have a bunch of vulnerabilities that are identified. So these are the issues, the misconfigurations that are covered, that we've identified in ThreatPath, and those are listed here. So these are all of the individual identified issues. There are approximately 40. And so you can look at the misconfigurations and deal with them as well. Now, the really cool thing about this is that you can identify which specific exposures you're looking for by checking these checkboxes, which specific OUs, and you can even do a search to look for a very specific item if you know your Active Directory. So, for example, if I look for Scott Gill, then this is all the information associated with Scott Gill that we've identified as a threat path. And then we can list all of the credentials. And here lists the credentials that are installed on green apples. Now, for example, green apples has not only regular production credentials, which are blue, but also orange credentials, which are decoy. So green apple has a bunch of decoy credentials installed on it just to make sure that there are that we can identify credential theft and reuse. So that is ThreatPath. So now let's look at the AD assessment. AD assessment. So this is the AD Assessor solution that we have. The goal of the AD Assessor solution is to identify exposures within Active Directory that are exploitable by an attacker. Now, we give a health score based on the approximately 200 checks and around 70 different exposures that we identify. And based on how many you pass will determine the risk level, the health score. Next to it is a graph that shows the findings, whether they're not vulnerable, or skipped. Skip means that for whatever reason, the evaluation couldn't be completed, whether it was a permission issue or the particular key didn't exist or for some other reason. The ones we're interested in, obviously, are the vulnerabilities, and these are listed from very high to low. There's also a table that lists all of these vulnerabilities. And again, each of these are filtered views. So if you click on any one of them, it'll take you immediately to the exposures tab with that filter. Next to that is a domain view. We can show a topologic by topology or by trust, and we color code the trusts to show you what the relationships are between the individual domain controllers. So in this case, production dom.local is the parent, and these two ops and corp domain controllers are childs of that domain. Across the middle, we have some statistics on the most common vulnerabilities, or the most critical vulnerabilities that we've identified. Some statistics on that above that. So here are the most vulnerable assessments, and here are the statistics on domains assessed, the users, and the systems that we've identified. And these will also show you which are vulnerable and which are not. Down at the lower left is a spark line that shows how you are doing. So whether you're improving, if the line goes down, you're improving. If the line goes up, that means that it's identified new exposures. So as you remediate these exposures, the spark line will drop down. As new exposures show up, because again, Active Directory is a living thing, it will change constantly. As new exposures show up, we will identify them as well. Now, these assessments can be triggered manually, or you can schedule them for whenever you want. Now, the more interesting part, though, is the exposures view. The exposures will show you exactly what you are looking at, because not everybody is an Active Directory expert. So what we do is we identify all of these exposures and then give you the details as to why they are an issue. So for example, here is the print nightmare vulnerability. So let's look at the details. Now, this is a demo. The finding is that it's a domain control with print spooler enabled, which is print nightmare. It's very high. It is a privilege escalation based on MITRE ATT&CK, and we identify the specific tactic and the categories that they fall under. And it is because the domain controllers with the print spooler services are vulnerable to the print nightmare vulnerability if not updated with the latest security patches. And here are the mitigation steps. So yes, we will also tell you how to fix it and what the mitigation steps are, if there are any available security patches, etc., if there are any known attack tools. Now, one that I like to point out, because most people tend to not understand how vulnerable it actually is this weak KRB TGT account, which is the Kerberos ticket granting ticket account. For those of you who understand the Kerberos ticket granting ticket account is what provides the service tickets and the Kerberos tickets for requests for authentication. Now, here is the reason why this is an issue. Because you can steal or forge a Kerberos ticket, it makes it vulnerable for a golden ticket attack. These are the tactics that are appropriate. Here is a summary. The known attack tool is Mimikatz, and here are the references. So here are some of the things that you can do to mitigate these steps. Otherwise, you can utilize the AD Assessor, because one of the things that AD Assessor can do is actually detect attacks that show up at the endpoints. That and one other solution that we have, which is called AD Secure. So that is the AD assessment. Now, the really cool thing is you can look at any of these assessments and identify what the actual issues are by viewing them. So in this case, this anonymous and unsigned LDAP allowed is a setting at the domain that you can then fix, and it covers 2 domains. Now, for something else like the LDAP unsigned, the domain controllers with print spooler enabled, this will tell you which domain controllers are actually vulnerable to that issue. Now, if it's account related, so for example, this unusual accounts with replication permissions, this allows a DC sync attack to happen. If that user account can replicate permissions, they can do a DC sync attack. So they can dump the credentials that are at the OS, and Mimikatz again is the tool that can be used to access this. Now, so for something like this, we can look at the individual accounts by viewing the affected objects. And so here are some users and student accounts that have this setting. So the student account has replicate changes all and replicate changes. The Puja account has replicate directory changes. Now, we don't know until we check if these are required for these users. So, but identifying them and knowing that they are an issue is the first step in remediating this vulnerability. And then, of course, you can configure any of the policies and look at things like that. So that is the AD Assessor solution. Now, next up, so that handles Active Directory. We talked about ThreatPath, which handles the endpoint. We talk about Active Directory, which is AD Assessor. And now let's talk about the cloud. And the cloud is our ID entitlement management solution, our cloud and infrastructure entitlement management solution called ID Entitle X. Now, ID Entitle X is a relatively new product that we released recently. It's been a little over 2 months, I think. And what this does is it looks for identity risks and entitlement exposures across your cloud environment, like other KIM solutions do. Where we differ is that we can also show existing Active Directory entitlement exposures, so and existing threat paths. So not only can we show you what's in your cloud environment from an entitlement perspective, but we can also show the access information, the Active Directory information, and the endpoint information as well. So very quickly, across the top is some summary information. This is across the year, and so the first number is the most recent, and the second is the total number discovered. So here across this 1-year period of that this AD has been running, we had 332 over the past year, but a total of 390 over the entire length of this deployment. We noticed that we support Azure and AWS. We will be adding support for Kubernetes as well. And as you notice that there's AWS, Azure, and again, as I mentioned, we also show Active Directory. Now, each of these is a tab, and the findings are specific to each environment. So common to all is the users by risk, groups by risk, and applications by risks, which you can view either as a table or as a graph. Now, this gives you summary information so that you can decide which ones you want to prioritize. And then below that, we list the high profile or high priority exposures and entitlements for Azure. Now, in this case, we'd have things like privileged access, the key vault management, which if you don't know what that is, you can highlight the tooltip and it will tell you exactly what it's identifying, storage access, virtual machines, etc. For AWS, we're looking at different things. We're looking at things like KMS access, which is the key management service, or Lambda access, which is your serverless computing, Route 53, your DNS, S3, which is your storage, DynamoDB access. So it's specific to each environment. So let's look at the Explorer. This Explorer will talk about all of the exposures, and we identify them by identity, resource, or roles and permissions. So if you want to look at something specifically by a resource, you can identify that. These items here are certificates or secrets. And then you have access keys and policies and things like that. And there are a lot of them. Notice there are 3 pages of this. If you want to look at it by specific role or permission, say you want to know who the Active Directory service accounts are, you can identify those as well. Or by identity. Now, identities will tell you the levels of the entitlements. It'll give you the risk level that's associated with it. So let's look at it from a high risk perspective. Let's look at one of these users that has some information. Let's look at Pranath. So as you notice here, when I clicked on Pranath, it gave me some detailed information on the right-hand pane. So this gives me the details. This tells me the group memberships and the role assignments. If there are any threat paths, which in this case there aren't, and any outbound entitlements. So these are all of the outbound entitlements. This user is on Azure. But where the power really shines is when we look at it from a graphical view. So now I can see the individual, and I can zoom in here so you can see this. Prashanta exists in Azure and has owner and default access to his applications, and he gets all of these permissions. So this is the who, this is the what, and this is the how. So here are the resources. He's got all of these access entitlements to Microsoft Graph. He's also global administrator for Azure Active Directory, and he has Azure subscriptions, belongs to Azure Subscriptions 1. He also has user impersonation for Windows Azure. For this key, he has client secret, and he also owns this site client secret. So these are certificates. Now, another user, let's pull up, I know is available, is Lab. So we look at Lab user, and you notice here that this user has several different paths available to him. I'm sorry, several outbound entitlements as well. It's a little bit easier to view. He has Azure Active Directory and AD Sync permissions. And so he's got these permissions to the Azure Active Directory, and he is a member of the AD Sync admins, meaning that he can sync on-premises AD to Azure Active Directory. Now, by resource, we can also look at it, like I said, and we can look at, for example, the Active Directory admins. So if I want to do a search, I can look for admins in the group, and then I can see which one has admins, the specific resource. So for example, all domain controllers, I can see who has access by looking at the inbound entitlements to all of those domain controllers. And so this lists all of the entitlements. So these are all the user accounts that have access to all the domain controllers. So these are the domain admins. And then, of course, as I said, we can look at it by entitlement as well. So if I want to know which role or permission has authenticated administrators, this tells me that this user has authenticated administrator for Azure Active Directory, and there's also an all roles assignment. And so this gives you a really good idea of all of the exposures by identity, resource, or role or permission within your cloud environment. And then as I showed you, let me see if there's anything here that has Active Directory. Let me see, resource. So we have Jill Benefield. So let's look at Jill Benefield. So this one shows you the AD privilege accounts, and she also has AWS at IT level 3 access. So this user is an AD privileged account, which has schema admin, belongs to the schema.admins.users.sudml.local group for all domain account controllers. And she also has an AWS account, with IT level 3 access. So she is a support person. So as you can see all of the Active Directory and cloud-based entitlements. So that covers what the attackers can see, because now that you can see everything the attacker can see from the endpoint, Active Directory, and the cloud, you can go and remove them before the attackers can take advantage of them. So let's now talk about cloaking critical assets. So now that we've reduced the attack surface, it's time to conceal sensitive or privileged credentials, Active Directory objects, data, and storage to prevent attacker exploitation. We can also here deploy decoys to occupy the attackers, which also obfuscates the attack surface. So let's talk about endpoints. At the endpoint, the goal is to cloak production assets, such as those that are listed here, by hiding and denying access from unauthorized users and processes. So the goal here is to obscure, cloak, prevent the attacker from actually seeing or even accessing these assets if he can guess where they are. So I will show you a little bit while later what that looks like, but for now, this is just the preparation phase. So we're going to then configure deflection, which redirects this any kind of service discovery activity to a black hole IP or a decoy, and then is deploying decoy credential lures to misdirect attacks away from the production assets. So that's everything that we do at the endpoints. Following that, we have to deploy our Active Directory permissions, which is where we will configure Active Directory concealment and misdirection to protect sensitive or privileged objects from unauthorized AD queries. Now, attackers will do queries to do discovery in the Active Directory to identify credentials and target other targets so that they can do privilege escalation and credential theft. We'll create deceptive responses to decoy AD objects to misinform the attackers. And while we're doing that, we're also polluting the data that they're mining from the domain controllers, because that's what they're doing when they're doing those directory queries. Next, optionally, we can deploy decoy systems to on-premises and cloud environments, including IT systems, OT devices, and native cloud technology decoys like serverless functions, storage buckets, and the like. The endpoint and AD deceptive assets can point to these decoy systems to enhance the deception fabric even further. So again, let's look at what that actually looks like. So this is our Active Directory, our AD Secure. This is our ThreatStrike solution. Our ThreatStrike solution is where we can create our decoy bait and lures and configure the credential protection. So let me show you what that looks like. So as you can see, we can insert credential lures, deceptive lures, and they can be any different types. They can be browser favorites, they can be cookies, they can be DNS entries, they can even be Kerberos tickets or LSAS or RDP credentials, etc. There's a bunch of different ones that we can do. We can do PuTTY, Telnet, a whole bunch of different credentials, and we can do them, as you can see, for Windows, Linux, and Apple, Macintosh, Mac OS. And it's very simple. All you're going to do is say we want to add a Telnet. So it's going to add a Telnet. We can choose the server object that we want it to point to, and then we can choose the user objects that we want to point to as well. Now, these are all automatically configured. When the system first connects to the network, it will automatically profile and connect your network environment and connect your Active Directory. So it will automatically create and customize decoys and these decoy credential objects that you can then configure. And then once you've provisioned these systems, then you can deploy them using any software deployment mechanism to the endpoints for installation. Now, there are two ways to install. You can install either as a dissolvable agent, as a dissolvable script, I should say. Now, the dissolvable script will load these credentials and then disappear. The problem with that is that you lose some essential monitoring capabilities, and the credentials will not reset their last access times and will age. And so we always recommend doing what's called resident mode or persistent mode, where when you install these, there is a small script that installs as a scheduled task that will automatically renew these credentials to show that they're in use. The next part of the ThreatStrike configuration is the production credentials. Now, notice here we have over 80 different applications that we can configure to protect. Now, these are production credentials, as I mentioned. So, for example, say we are using the Fortinet VPN client, right? And I want to protect all of the credentials in the credential store that gets saved to the Fortinet VPN client. So I'm going to enable that. I'm going to change it to protect, and I'm going to hide these credentials. So now that I've done that, what it means is that an attacker that uses an application like Lasagna, for example, which can dump credentials from the endpoint, won't be able to access any of these credentials, because the only executable that can access these credentials is the FortiClient VPN client. So here's another example. Let's look at, let's see, where is Putty? So here's Putty. It's a remote admin tool. I can enable it and I can save it. I can protect it, and then I can make it so that they can't see it at all. So you can save credentials in Putty or the Putty connection manager. And now that I've protected it so that the attackers can't dump those credentials. Or for example, we've got browsers. Now something like Chrome, for example. Chrome will store credentials in a database in your in a data directory for that user profile. So here's Google Chrome. If I activate it, I'm going to change it so that now only Chrome, the Chrome executable, can access that credential store and no other application can. This way, your systems, your actual production credentials that you're saving on your endpoints are protected from credential dumping tools. The next part is AD Secure. So AD Secure is our Active Directory protection solution that happens at the endpoint. What it does is it looks for unauthorized queries from an unauthorized user or unauthorized process. And what it will do is it will hide the critical results that you configure, the sensitive or privileged results that you configure, and insert decoy results in their place. So here, I'm going to edit one of these. Oops. And I will edit this demo profile. Here I have a bunch of credentials. I have 4 domain admins that I've added with 10 deceptive credentials. Now the deceptive credentials in this case are actors. You'll see this next week. But notice here that I've created a bunch of decoy credentials, decoy objects that I've now assigned to a decoy domain, a decoy server. So I've added that. I've also added a bunch of service accounts and a decoy domain controller. I've also gone and hidden all of the privileged accounts on the domain controllers. So not only have I hidden all of the privileged accounts, that includes the account operators, administrators, domain admins, enterprise admins, etc. But I've also hidden the service accounts, and I've hidden and I've done some stuff with the domain controllers as well. So what this means is, if and when an attacker decides to query for any of those objects, the AD Secure solution will hide the critical results from the resulting query and insert those decoy results in their place. So that is how you configure all of the concealment. Now, this finishes part 1 of the bootcamp. Next week, we will be doing part 2, where we will discuss what to do during an attack. And all of those things that I've shown you in terms of configuration, we're going to actually see the practical applications and how they can affect what an attacker sees and how the attacker can attack and try to exploit identities. Now, to learn more about the ThreatPath platform and the various free trial offers, please visit us at www.ativonetworks.com.